A group of organizations says Ontarians visited food banks a total of 4.3 million times between April 2021 and March of this year, which is a 42% increase from 2019. Feed Ontario's annual hunger report found that more than 587,000 adults and children used food banks in that same period. Now, that's a 15% increase. Feed Ontario is blaming employment issues, inadequate disability supports, the pandemic, high inflation, and the rising cost of living. It's calling on the province to invest in housing and improve social assistance. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Miss Carolyn Stewart, Executive Director of Feed Ontario, which is a collective of 1,200 partner food banks. Ms. Stewart, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having us.
Now, what's interesting here is that food banks were started as a temporary measure about 40 years ago in response to a recession in the 1980s. So tell us a little bit more about how food banks have evolved and their current presence in Canada.
Yeah, I think ultimately some of the statistics that you've already shared is should be concerning to all of us. Food bank use has been on the rise for 6 straight years as we see the financial health of Ontarians decline, and the fact that so many people are now relying on emergency food support to get by should really be worrying to all of us. Food banks, were started in the 80s as a short-term response to the recession at that time, and really were never intended to be a lasting solution. But we're seeing more and more Ontarians who are unable to afford their most basic necessities. And this is really because of a number of factors that have really contributed to making it increasingly difficult for Ontarians to improve their financial circumstances. So, even this year's report actually highlighted that it's even more difficult for someone to lift themselves out of poverty. And in fact, a child born in the 80s is actually 22% more likely to remain in poverty as an adult born in the 60s. And so, just these shifts in labor markets, the dismantling of our social safety net has really created a perfect storm and forced a reliance on our services at food banks.
Some really concerning data there, Ms. Stewart. Now, let's talk a little bit more about these socioeconomic issues that Feed Ontario is highlighting as a contributor to this growing need for food banks, especially when it comes to social assistance and housing in particular. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, social assistance programs were created as a social safety net. So, where someone might go through a bad patch, have an injury, lose their job, it's really meant to be something that allowed people to get back on their feet quickly. But unfortunately, these programs have been dismantled over time. And the more and more that they're dismantled, they're no longer serving the purpose they first intended. And so, if you're someone on Ontario Works who makes somewhere around $750 a month, and then someone on the Ontario Disability Support Program where it's just somewhere between $1,200 and $1,300 a month, you fall way below the poverty line. So really being able to afford your most basic necessities is virtually impossible. And if we're looking at something also like affordable housing, at one point Ontario was actually the leader in building affordable housing, building one unit per 14 people, and now it's one per 200 people. We've just slowed down, and so this access to affordable housing is just an increasing issue. I think everyone can feel those pressures, but for those living in poverty and with a low income, the cost of housing is a fixed cost, and many of the people who are accessing our services have less than $100 left per month after paying for their housing. So how are you supposed to pay for all your other expenses? After you have to pay for food, transport to work, even winter clothes for your children, heat or hydro. People are having to make impossible choices between all of these expenses, and it's really not something that should be happening, which is why we've made some key recommendations in this year's hunger report on how to make change.
All right, Ms. Stewart, a quick minute left here, but can you go over some of the major recommendations in this report for the provincial government and any responses you've received from officials so far?
Yeah, we've made four key recommendations for change to start moving that needle forward. So, firstly, improving the quality of work. So, things like equal pay for equal work, instituting a livable wage. Also, improvements to social assistance, as we've discussed, doubling the financial support provided through the program, investing in affordable housing. So, building more affordable rental homes and new supportive housing units. And finally, putting people at the center of policy design. So, really including the perspective of people with lived experience at the center of policy design to make sure that it's actually accessible and addressing their needs.
And have you heard back from officials regarding these requests here?
We always are hopeful, and we believe that the government at all levels shares our vision of ending hunger and poverty in Ontario. So we have sent our most recent reports to them, and we look forward to connecting with them to discuss these recommendations further.
We look forward to it as well. Ms. Stewart, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having us.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at the recent public anger in China over COVID-19 restrictions. Stay with us. We'll be right back.